Amazing morning, senior high school students. Welcome to our Earth and Life Science virtual classroom. I am Mr. Jonathan F. Alvances of Valenzuela National High School from Senior High School Department. Join me in another exciting Valenzuela Live session full of excitement and knowledge about life science. For today's lesson, we are going to learn more about the classification of organisms based on evolutionary relationships. Before we proceed, let us first have the most essential learning competency that we need to attain today. Describe how the present system of classification of organisms is based on evolutionary relationships. Let us set our mood by having a classic game of 4 picks, 1 word. If you ever played this game, you know the mechanics. In this activity, we will have 5 sets of pictures. Each set will display 4 pictures linked by 1 word. Your aim is to work out what the word is from a set of letters given beside the pictures. You will be given 5 seconds to type your answer in the comment section. Are you ready? Then let's begin. Set number 1. These are the 4 pictures. Guess the right word. Timer starts now. If your answer is evolution, you are correct. Set number 2. These are the 4 pictures. Guess the right word. Timer starts now. If your answer is mutation, you are correct. Set number 3. These are the 4 pictures. Guess the right word. Timer starts now. If your answer is fossils, you are correct. Set number 4. These are the 4 pictures. Guess the right word. Timer starts now. If your answer is anatomy, you are correct. And for the last set, these are the 4 pictures. Guess the right word. Timer starts now. If your answer is selection, you are correct. You have done a great job. We will be encountering these different words as we proceed to our discussion. At this point, we are going to start the discussion of our lesson. Let us begin by defining what is evolution. Evolution is the change in genetic composition of a population over time as a result of differential reproduction of individuals. It is the process by which different living organisms develop and diversified from earlier forms during the history of the Earth. We can trace the development of modern concept of evolution to Charles Darwin, famous work on the origin of species. It was noted that the first editions of his book never actually used the term evolution, but rather Darwin used the phrase descent with modification. However, he was not the first to propose a theory of evolution. He followed a long line of earlier philosophers and naturalists who studies the process of evolution. One of the other theories of evolution aside from the works of Darwin is that of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, a prominent biologist. He proposed that evolution occurred through the inheritance of acquired characteristics. According to him, changes that individuals acquired during their lives were passed on to their offspring. Let's take the giraffes as an example. Lamarck proposed that ancestral giraffes with short necks tended to stretch their necks to feed on tree leaves, and keeps on stretching its neck in order to reach the leaves on taller trees. This acquired characteristic of the extension of the neck was passed on to subsequent generations, leading to the long-necked giraffe that we have known today. In contrast, Darwin's theory suggested that variation is not created through experience, but it is the result of our pre-existing genetic differences among individuals. Applying his postulate with our prior example with giraffes, he explained that long-necked and short-necked giraffes existed together. However, due to the advantageous characteristic of long-necked giraffes being able to reach leaves from tall trees, over many generations, longer-necked individuals are more successful, perhaps because they can feed on taller trees and pass the long-neck trait on their offspring. The short-necked giraffes slowly disappear, and this is why we only see long-necked giraffes today. That evolutionary concept of Darwin is the main idea of natural selection. Unlike his predecessors, Darwin proposed natural selection as the mechanism of evolution. Natural selection produces evolutionary change when some individuals in a population possess certain characteristics and produce more offspring than individuals lacking these desirable characteristics. As a result, the population gradually comes to include more and more individuals with the advantageous characteristics. In this way, the population evolves and becomes better adapted to environmental circumstances. In the case of the long-necked and short-necked giraffes, the long-necked giraffes are better suited to the environment since they have long necks, which makes them able to reach leaves from trees. And the short-necked giraffes disappear because they cannot adapt to the environmental circumstances. Now, to answer the question, why does evolution happens? Evolution occurs when heritable differences become more common or rare in a population, either non-randomly through natural selection or randomly through genetic drift. Natural selection is a process that causes heritable traits that are helpful for survival and reproduction to become more common and undesirable traits to become more rare. This occurs because organisms with advantageous traits pass on more copies of these heritable traits to the next generation. Now, we will discuss the factors of evolution. Evolution is the change in the inherited trait of a population from generation to generation. These traits are the expression of genes that are copied and passed on to offspring during reproduction. There are factors of evolution, and these factors are considered agents that can cause genetic variation and evolutionary change in a population. The factors of evolution includes mutation, gene flow, non-random mating, genetic drift, and natural selection. Let us discuss each of these factors one by one. First is mutation. Mutation is considered as the ultimate source of genetic variation and thus makes evolution possible. Mutation creates new genetic variation in a gene pool and it is how all new alleles first rise. Why do some organisms survive while others die? These surviving organisms generally possess traits or characteristics that bestow benefits that help them survive. Examples are better camouflage, faster swimming, or more efficient digestion. Each of these characteristics is the result of a mutation or a change in the genetic code. Mutations occur spontaneously, but not all mutations are heritable. The heritable mutations are responsible for the rise of new traits in a population. Next, we have gene flow. Gene flow is the movement of alleles from one population to another. If gene pools are different, the exchange of genes can introduce variation. If advantageous, the gene variation may replace other variations until the entire population exhibits that trait. Sometimes gene flow is obvious. For example, when an animal physically moves from one place to another, if the characteristics of the newly arrived individual differ from those of animals already there, and if the newcomer is adapted well enough to the new area to survive and mate successfully, the genetic composition of the receiving population may be altered. Next is non-random mating. Individuals with certain genotype sometimes mate with one another, more commonly than expected in a random basis. This phenomenon is known as non-random mating, and this type of mating shifts the genotype frequencies. Two types of non-random mating is assortative and disassortative mating. Assortative mating, in which phenotypically individuals or individuals with the same observable characteristics mate. It causes an increase in the proportion of homozygous individuals because phenotypically similar individuals are likely to be genetically similar. In contrast, this assortative mating, in which phenotypically different individuals mate, producing heterozygous individuals. Next is genetic drift. In small populations, frequencies of particular alleles may change drastically by chance alone. Such changes in allele frequencies occur randomly, as if the frequencies were drifting from their values. These changes are known as genetic drift. Genetic frequencies tend to drift due to random events. There are two special conditions under which genetic drift occurs. They are called bottleneck effect and founder effect. Bottleneck effect occurs when a population suddenly gets much smaller. This might happen because of a natural disaster such as forest fire or death, as illustrated in the example of frogs. By chance, allele frequencies of the survivors may be different from those of the original population. Founder effect occurs when a few individuals start or found a new population. By chance, allele frequencies of the founders may be different from allele frequencies of the population they left. Last factor of evolution is natural selection. As Darwin pointed out, some individuals who are better adapted with the environmental conditions produce more offspring. We describe the result of this process as selection. In natural selection, environment determines which individuals produce the most offspring. Just as mutations cause new traits in a population, natural selection acts on the frequency of those traits. Because there are more organisms than resources, all organisms are in a constant struggle for existence. In natural selection, those individuals with superior traits will be able to produce more offspring. The more offspring an organism can produce, the higher is its fitness. Those are the five agents of evolution: mutation, gene flow, non-random mating, genetic drift, and natural selection. Moving on to our next subtopic under this lesson, we will study about phylogeny. Phylogeny is the study of relationships among different groups of organisms and their evolutionary development. It attempts to trace the evolutionary history of all life on planet. It is based on the hypothesis that living organisms share a common ancestry. The relationships among organisms are depicted in what is known as a phylogenetic tree, which is shown on the picture. Relationships are determined by shared characteristics, as indicated through the comparison of genetic and anatomical similarities. A phylogeny describes the relationships of an organism, such as from which organism it is thought to have evolved, to which species it is most closely related. Scientists use a tool called a phylogenetic tree to show the evolutionary pathways and connections among organisms. A phylogenetic tree, or cladogram, also called as evolutionary tree, is a schematic diagram used to reflect evolutionary relationships among organisms or group of organisms, how they are related, and their most common ancestors. Scientists consider phylogenetic trees to be a hypothesis of the evolutionary past, since one cannot go back to confirm the proposed relationships. In other words, a phylogenetic tree can be constructed to illustrate when different organisms evolved and to show the relationships among different organisms. If we try to compare phylogenetic tree to a family tree, just like a family tree, an evolutionary tree indicates which ancestors gave rise to which descendants. Family trees help show how people are related to each other. Similarly, scientists use cladogram and phylogenetic trees to study the relationships between organisms. Now, the question is, how to read a phylogenetic tree? There are many different ways to draw a phylogeny, but they all do have certain parts that we must understand before we try to interpret them. The root of a phylogeny represents the common ancestor of all the descendants in the tree. The descendant taxa are labeled at the tips of the tree. The node itself represents the common ancestors of any descendants that branch off of it. Branches are the lines on a phylogenetic tree that represent ancestral and descendant lineages. Branches arising from nodes represent descendant species that split from a common ancestor. If you want to determine how two or more taxa are related, it is important to look at the nodes and branches in a tree and not just the ordering of the descendant taxa. The tips of the tree represent groups of descendant taxon. Plural is taxa, which is often a group of species. A clade is a group that includes an ancestor and all of its descendants. It is a piece of a phylogeny that includes an ancestral lineages and all the descendants of that ancestor. A lineage that evolved early from the root and remains unbranched is called basal taxon. A node splits into two branches and indicates a divergence or speciation event. The two lineages that branch off a node are called sister taxa. They share an immediate common ancestor. Sometimes, the evolutionary relationships between taxa cannot be determined. This results in a phylogeny with a polytomy. A branch with more than two lineages is called a polytomy and serves to illustrate where scientists have not definitely determined all of the relationships. There are three types of clades. First, the monophyletic group, which is a single branch on a phylogenetic tree that represents a group of organisms that are descended from a most recent common ancestor. In this example, the clade comprising taxa A, taxa B, taxa C, and taxa D is monophyletic. Everything that descends from the ancestral lineage or organism that existed at the point marked by the red arrow belongs in that clade, and thus it is a monophyletic group. For example, mammals are a monophyletic group because they all descended from a common ancestor. Within the mammals, there are also many smaller clades, such as primates or bats. Not all groupings of organisms qualify as monophyletic. A paraphyletic group consists of an ancestor and only some of its descendants. Here, the green arrows indicate, first, the monophyletic group which we are considering, the taxa from taxa A to taxa F. And then, the second monophyletic group that we are not considering, the taxa A and B. Thus, leaving us with the paraphyletic clade of taxa C, D, E, and F. Reptiles like crocodiles, lizards, and snakes is actually a paraphyletic grouping because the ancestor that gave rise to all the reptiles also gave rise to birds. If birds are added to the definition of reptiles, then it could be considered a monophyletic group. A polyphyletic group is made up of various descendants with no recent common ancestor. Here, the various blue highlighted taxa, which are taxa B, C, E, F, and H, have been pulled out together into a polyphyletic group. And again, one could do this in a great many ways on even small tree. Polyphyletic groups are rarely mentioned, but they do come up occasionally when a revision has led to a previously monophyletic or even paraphyletic group being declared polyphyletic as a result of some systematic rearrangement. Marine mammals are polyphyletic. Whales and seals are both marine mammals, but they are not closely related at all. Seals are most closely related to bears than they are to whales. Whales share a more recent common ancestor with deer than they do to seals. Biologists who postulate phylogeny derive their most useful evidences from the following: fossil records, comparative anatomy, comparative embryology, and molecular biology. Let us discuss each of these fields. Fossils document the existence of extinct species, showing that different organisms have lived on Earth during different periods of the planet's history. The fossil record is often used to determine the phylogeny of groups containing hard body parts. It is also used to date divergence of time of species in phylogeny that have been constructed basis of molecular evidence. They can also help scientists reconstruct the evolutionary history of present-day species. Shown on the picture is the tentative phylogenetic scheme for the evolution of the human lineage using fossil records as basis. Next is comparative anatomy. It is the study of the similarities and differences in the structures of different species. It focuses on anatomical traits. Similar body parts may be homologies or analogies. Both structures provide evidence for evolution. In comparing features common to different species, anatomists try to distinguish between homologies or similarities inherited from a common ancestor and analogies or similarities that arise in response to similar habits and living conditions. Homologous structures are structures that are similar in related organisms because they were inherited from a common ancestor. These structures may or may not have the same function in the descendants. Let's look at the picture as an example. The figure shows the hands of several different mammals. They all have the same basic pattern of bones, which suggests that they inherited this pattern from a common ancestor. However, their forelimbs now have different functions. On the other hand, the analogous structures are structures that are similar in unrelated organisms. The structures are similar because they evolved to do the same task, but not because they were inherited from a common ancestor. Figure shows an example of an analogous structure. The butterfly and birdwing have evolved with similar function for two different organisms, but when compared, the wings have different internal structures. This suggests that insects and birds are not closely related. Another structure studied in comparative anatomy is the vestigial structure. Structures like the human tailbone and whale pelvis are called vestigial structures. Evolution has reduced their size because the structures are no longer used. The human appendix, which is shown in the picture, is another example of a vestigial structure. It is a tiny remnant of a once larger organ. In a distant ancestor, appendix was needed to digest food, but it serves no known purpose in humans today. That is why it is classified as a vestigial structure. Next evidence in phylogeny is comparative embryology. It aims to understand how embryos develop and show the interrelatedness of animals. It has reinforced evolutionary theory by showing that all vertebrates have same embryonic development and have a presumed common ancestor. It suggests that animals with the same embryonic development and pattern may be related. Examples of evidence from embryology which supports common ancestry includes the tail and gill slits present in all early vertebrate embryos as shown in the picture. Comparative embryology reveals homologies which form during development but may later disappear. All vertebrate embryos develop tails, though adult humans retain only the coccyx. All vertebrate embryos show gill slits, though this develop into gill openings only in fish and larval amphibians. In humans, gill slits form the lower jaw and eustachian tube. Many scientists consider developmental homologies as an evidence for common ancestry. Last is the molecular biology. Similarities between biological molecules can reflect shared evolutionary ancestry. At the most basic level, all living organisms share the same genetic material, which is DNA, the same or highly similar genetic codes, and the same process of gene expression, which is transcription and translation. These shared features suggest that all living things are descended from a common ancestor. One evidence used in the evolutionary biology is the cytochrome C, which is shown in the picture. Cytochrome C is a highly conserved protein present among all the species, which indicates its important function. And it also suggests that despite varying phenotype, all the organisms have common metabolic mechanisms. The picture shows the phylogeny based on differences in the protein sequence of cytochrome C in organisms ranging from Neurospora mold to humans. If we also compare the sequence of nucleotides in the DNA of one organism to the sequence in another, we see remarkable similarities. For example, human DNA sequences are 98 to 99% the same as those of chimpanzees and 50% the same as those of bananas. These similarities reflect similar metabolisms. Those are the evidences for phylogeny of organisms: fossil records, comparative anatomy, comparative embryology, and molecular biology. Before we proceed with the assessment, let us first have a summary of our lesson. Remember, number 1, evolution is the change in genetic composition of a population over time, resulting from differential reproduction of individuals. Number 2, the development of modern concept of evolution can be traced back to Charles Darwin's famous work on the origin of species. 3, natural selection is the process in which populations of living organisms adapt and change. 4, the factors of evolution includes mutation, gene flow, non-random mating, genetic drift, and natural selection. Phylogeny is the study of relationships among different groups of organisms and their evolutionary development. 6. A phylogenetic tree is a schematic diagram used to reflect evolutionary relationships among organisms. And 7. The evidences of phylogeny includes fossil records, comparative anatomy and embryology, and molecular biology. We will now test your knowledge. Read and analyze each question. Choose the letter of the correct answer and write it in a piece of paper. You will be given 5 seconds to answer each question. Are you ready? Let's begin. Number 1. What is the definition of common ancestry? A. The sequence of heritable changes that occurred among species since the origin of life on Earth. B. The mineralized remains of organisms and the rock layers. C. When organisms are descended from a single ancestor? D. The study of the structure of animals or plants and their parts. Timer starts now. If your answer is letter C, you are correct. Common ancestry is defined when organisms are descended from a single ancestor. Question number 2. What is the study of the structure of animals or plants and their parts? A. Common ancestry. B. Anatomy. C. Fossil record. Or D. Evolutionary history. Time starts now. If your answer is letter B, you are correct. Anatomy is the study of the structure of animals or plants and their parts. Question number 3. Consider the evolutionary theory. Which is the best description of the two organisms inside the box? A. They are ancestors of each other. B. They are extinct species. C. They belong to the same species. Or D. They share a recent common ancestor. Your time starts now. If your answer is letter D, you are correct. The two organisms inside the box share a recent common ancestor. Question number 4. Which of the following statements below reinforced evolutionary theory to the study of comparative embryology? A. The similarity of embryonic development in vertebrates. B. The evidence of evolution in human lineage using fossils. C. The homologous structure of forelimbs in several mammals. Or D. The same genetic material of organisms. Your time starts now. If your answer is letter A, you are correct. The study of comparative embryology reinforced evolutionary theory because of its study the similarity of embryonic development in vertebrates. Question number 5. What factor of evolution is depicted when organisms adapt to the environment and produce more offspring? A. Genetic drift. B. Natural selection. C. Gene flow. Or D. Non-random mating. Your time starts now. If your answer is letter B, you are correct. Natural selection is when organisms adapt to the environment and produce more offspring. For your questions and clarifications about our lesson for today, kindly coordinate with your respective subject teachers during your follow-up session. And I will leave you with the words of the great naturalist Charles Darwin. It is not the strongest of the species that survives, not the most intelligent that survives. It is the one that is the most adaptable to change. That ends our class. Thank you for listening and see you on our next Valenzuela Live streaming session.